The Galactic Council chambers were massive, filled with the strange sounds and smells of dozens of alien species. Ambassador Margaret Thompson sat in her small chair, looking tiny compared to the towering creatures around her. She wore her best formal jacket, the dark blue one with the Earth symbol on the shoulder, but she felt invisible among all these powerful beings. For 300 years, humanity had been part of this galactic community. 300 years of sitting in these same chambers, asking for the same basic rights that every other species seemed to have automatically. Margaret had been doing this job for 20 years now, and she was tired. Tired of being ignored, tired of being dismissed, tired of watching her people suffer while aliens who had never even visited human colonies made decisions about their fate. The Zephyrian delegate was speaking again. He was 12 feet tall, made of what looked like living crystal, and his voice echoed through the chamber like breaking glass. The humans request access to the Kepler system trade routes, he announced, his tone making it clear what he thought of that idea. This request is denied. The established trade patterns cannot be disrupted for the convenience of a single species. Margaret felt her stomach clench, but she kept her face calm. The Kepler routes were vital for supplying the outer human colonies. Without access to those shipping lanes, thousands of families would go without medical supplies, food shipments would be delayed by months, and the struggling agricultural settlements would probably have to be abandoned. She had explained all of this in her formal petition. She had provided detailed economic projections, population data, humanitarian concerns. None of it mattered. Captain William Davis sat beside her, his military uniform crisp and his medals polished. He was supposed to be her military advisor, but really he was just there to look official. The other species tolerated human military representatives as long as they understood they were decoration. William's hands were folded on the table, but Margaret could see his knuckles were white. He felt the same frustration she did, multiplied by his natural soldier's instinct to actually do something about problems instead of just talking about them endlessly. The Kithran War Prime spoke next. He looked like a giant armored insect, with 4 arms and mandibles that clicked when he talked. His species had conquered half a dozen worlds in the last century, and everyone just accepted it as normal Kithran behavior. Perhaps, he said, his voice buzzing with what Margaret had learned was their equivalent of laughter, the humans should focus on managing their existing territories more effectively. Weak species often overextend themselves when they lack the strength to properly defend their claims. Around the chamber, other delegates made similar sounds of agreement or amusement. The Vel hegemony representatives, who looked like tall gray beings with too many eyes, exchanged glances that Margaret knew meant they were sharing private thoughts through their telepathic network. They found human limitations amusing. The ancient ethereal collective floated in their environmental suits, barely acknowledging that humans existed at all. Margaret stood up slowly. The chamber didn't exactly fall silent, but the conversation volume dropped as various species remembered that humans were technically allowed to speak during these sessions. Honored delegates, she began, using the formal address that protocol required, humanity seeks only peaceful coexistence and fair access to established trade routes. Our colonies pose no threat to any existing territories or established interests. The Zephyrian delegate's crystal form shifted, light refracting through his body in patterns that Margaret had learned indicated condescension. Ambassador Thompson, your species has been granted significant privileges already. Perhaps you should be grateful for what you have rather than constantly demanding more. What they called privileges, Margaret called basic survival needs. The right to defend their own shipping. Access to common medical supplies. Permission to establish communication relays between their scattered settlements. Things that other species took for granted were treated as special favors when humans asked for them. The session dragged on for another 3 hours. Every human request was denied or referred to subcommittees that would meet sometime in the next decade. Margaret presented carefully prepared arguments, detailed proposals, desperate pleas disguised as diplomatic language. Nothing worked. It never worked. As the session finally ended, Margaret gathered her documents and walked toward the exit. The corridor leading back to the human embassy wing was long and lined with windows that showed the sprawling capital city of the Galactic Council. Millions of beings from hundreds of species lived and worked here, making decisions that affected entire civilizations. Somewhere in that vast city, her own people lived in a small section reserved for humans, always aware that they were tolerated rather than welcomed. Lieutenant James Parker, her aide, fell into step beside her. He was young, maybe 25, and still believed that persistence and good intentions could change minds. Margaret remembered being that optimistic once. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "how much longer can we keep doing this?" How long can we keep accepting their restrictions while our people struggle? Margaret paused at one of the large windows looking out at the alien city. Ships from a dozen different species moved through the air traffic patterns, conducting the business of galactic civilization. None of them were human ships. Humans weren't allowed to operate commercial flights in council space without special permits that took years to obtain and could be revoked without explanation. As long as it takes, James, she said finally. We're not like them. We don't solve problems with violence. We find peaceful solutions no matter what it costs us. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, but they were true. Humanity had always chosen the diplomatic path, always turned the other cheek, always found ways to compromise and accommodate. It was what made them different from the warrior species and the conquerors. It was supposed to make them better. Neither Margaret nor James could have imagined, as they walked back to their small embassy that day, how soon those words would be tested beyond all recognition. The emergency alert reached Ambassador Margaret Thompson at 3 a.m, Council Standard Time. She woke up in her small quarters in the human embassy wing, her communicator buzzing with the urgent tone that meant something terrible had happened. She grabbed the device with shaking hands, still half asleep, expecting news of another trade dispute or diplomatic incident. Instead, she saw Admiral Robert Mitchell's face on the screen. His expression was unlike anything she had ever seen from the usually calm military leader. His eyes were red, his jaw was tight, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with barely controlled emotion. Margaret, New Geneva is gone, he said simply. All of it. 2 million people. The words hit her like a physical blow. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the screen, unable to process what she was hearing. New Geneva was one of their most peaceful settlements, an agricultural station that grew food for dozens of human colonies. It was home to farmers and their families, children who had never seen Earth, elderly people who had chosen to spend their final years working in the beautiful hydroponic gardens that fed half the human frontier. How? She whispered. Admiral Mitchell's face grew even darker. Kithran military exercise. War Prime Thaxon ordered weapons testing in what he called an unimportant system. They knew we were there, Margaret. They knew exactly who lived on that station. Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach. Military exercises were common among the warrior species. They happened all the time in the outer systems, usually with advance warning so civilian traffic could avoid the area. But New Geneva had been there for 40 years. It was clearly marked on all navigation charts as a human settlement. She dressed quickly and made her way to the embassy communications center. The night shift staff looked up as she entered, their faces reflecting the same shock and disbelief she felt. Lieutenant James Parker was already there, his young face pale as he monitored incoming reports from human colonies across the galaxy. Ma'am, he said quietly, we're getting confirmation from multiple sources. The Kithran Third Fleet conducted what they're calling a routine weapons test, using high-energy plasma charges. They targeted the station directly. Margaret sat down at her communication console and opened a priority channel to the Galactic Council Emergency Response System. Within minutes, she had connections to representatives from all the major species. The Zephyrian delegate appeared first, his crystal form shimmering with what might have been concern. Ambassador Thompson, he said in his glass-breaking voice, we understand there has been an incident involving human civilians. The Council expresses its regret for this unfortunate occurrence. Unfortunate occurrence. 2 million human lives reduced to an unfortunate occurrence. The Vel hegemony representative joined the communication next, followed by others. Margaret found herself looking at the same faces she had pleaded with just days before, the same beings who had denied her requests for basic trade rights and defensive permissions. Now they were offering their condolences for what they were already calling an accident. War Prime Thaxon's image appeared last, his armored insect features showing no emotion at all. His mandibles clicked as he spoke, the sound somehow more irritating than usual. The Kithran Empire regrets any unintended casualties that may have occurred during necessary military operations. However, species that establish settlements in contested space must understand the risks involved. Margaret stared at him through the screen. Contested space? New Geneva has been a registered human settlement for 40 years. There was no military activity in that system. No conflicts, no territorial disputes. Thaxon's mandibles clicked again, faster this time. Margaret had learned that this was their equivalent of dismissive laughter. Weak species often misunderstand the complexities of galactic security. Perhaps this will serve as a valuable lesson about proper territorial management. The other species representatives remained silent. Not one of them challenged Thaxon's words. Not one of them demanded answers or accountability. They were going to let this pass as just another unfortunate incident, another price that humanity would have to pay for being the weakest species in galactic civilization. Margaret felt something change inside her as she looked at their faces. These beings had spent 3 centuries treating human concerns as minor inconveniences. They had denied every request, dismissed every plea, ignored every warning about the growing desperation in human colonies. And now, when faced with the deliberate murder of 2 million innocent people, they were offering polite regrets and suggesting it was somehow humanity's own fault. "I see," she said quietly. Her voice was so calm that Lieutenant Parker looked up from his station with surprise. "Thank you all for your time and your expressions of concern." She reached forward and did something she had never done in 20 years of diplomatic service. She terminated the communication without waiting for responses, cutting off every connection simultaneously. The Embassy Communications Center fell completely silent. The night shift staff stared at her in shock. In the entire 3-century history of human-alien relations, no human diplomat had ever simply hung up on the Galactic Council leadership. Margaret stood up from her console and walked to the secure communication terminal in the corner of the room. She entered her highest-level authorization codes and opened a direct channel to Earth. Admiral Mitchell's face appeared on screen immediately. "Robert," she said, her voice still unnaturally calm, "I need you to send a message to Fleet Command. Tell them to activate Protocol Omega immediately." Admiral Mitchell's eyes widened. Protocol Omega was theoretical, a contingency plan that had been developed decades ago but never seriously considered for implementation. "Margaret, are you sure? Once we activate that protocol, there's no going back to the way things were." Margaret looked around the communications center, thinking about the faces of the alien delegates who had just dismissed the deaths of 2 million humans as an unfortunate occurrence. She thought about 40 years of rejected petitions, denied rights, and casual humiliation. She thought about the children of New Geneva who would never grow up, the farmers who would never see another harvest. "I'm sure," she said. "Humanity is done talking." The first sign that something fundamental had changed came at exactly 0600 Standard Time across 17 star systems. Human merchant ships, the reliable vessels that had become as common as local traffic in alien ports, simply vanished from sensor grids. They didn't file departure notices, didn't request clearance, didn't follow any of the careful procedures that had governed human space travel for 3 centuries. They just left. On the Zephyrian trade station orbiting their capital world, Station Master Krell watched his displays in confusion. 43 human cargo vessels had been docked at his facility the previous evening. Now his sensors showed empty docking bays and no trace of human ships anywhere in the system. The cargo containers they had been scheduled to load sat abandoned on the station decks. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. The Vel Hegemony's primary shipping hub lost 67 human vessels overnight. The Ethereal Collective's crystal mining operations found their human technical staff and transport ships gone without explanation. Even the Kithran military bases discovered that their human maintenance contractors had disappeared along with their ships. Admiral Robert Mitchell stood on the bridge of the TDF Resolute, watching tactical displays that would have shocked the galactic community. What appeared to be humanity's peaceful merchant fleet was revealing capabilities that no other species had suspected existed. Cargo ships were unfolding hidden weapon systems. Scientific research vessels were activating military-grade shields and sensors. Transport craft were deploying fighter squadrons that shouldn't have fit in their cargo holds. "Admiral, all fleets report ready status," announced Captain Elizabeth Hayes from the communications station. Her voice was steady, but Mitchell could hear the excitement underneath. For decades, human military officers had trained for a conflict they hoped would never come. Now that it was here, they were discovering that their preparations had been more thorough than anyone realized. The truth was that humanity had been learning for 3 centuries. Every diplomatic insult had been recorded and analyzed. Every trade restriction had been studied for tactical implications. Every casual dismissal by alien species had been catalogued as intelligence about their thinking patterns and strategic blind spots. Commander Thomas Wright, head of Human Strategic Intelligence, had spent 30 years preparing for this moment. His office on the moon base looked ordinary, filled with standard military reports and diplomatic files. But hidden in those documents was the most comprehensive intelligence network any species had ever assembled. "They never realized what they were teaching us," he explained to his staff as Operation Reckoning began. "Every time they denied our requests, they showed us their decision-making processes. Every time they dismissed our concerns, they revealed their priorities and weaknesses. Every casual insult taught us exactly how they see the galaxy and their place in it. The human trade network had been the perfect cover. For 300 years, human merchants had traveled to every major world, every important station, every strategic location in known space. They had maintained equipment, delivered supplies, provided services that the major species had gradually become dependent on. What nobody realized was that every human trader was also gathering information, mapping defenses, and installing hidden monitoring equipment. Captain Michael Foster commanded a fleet of what the galaxy had known as peaceful exploration vessels. His ships had been charting new systems and conducting scientific surveys for decades, always requesting permission politely, always staying within approved boundaries, always appearing completely harmless. Now those same vessels were revealing their true nature as advanced military scouts with stealth capabilities that far exceeded anything the major species possessed. The beautiful thing about being underestimated, Foster told his bridge crew as they approached Kithran space, is that nobody bothers to watch you very carefully. They've been letting us map their defenses for decades. The Kithran Empire received humanity's declaration of war not through traditional diplomatic channels, but through the simultaneous shutdown of every human-maintained system in their territory. Life support systems that humans had installed and serviced stopped working. Communication networks that relied on human-designed components went dark. Transportation systems that used human navigation updates became unreliable. Warprime Thaxon stood in his command center, watching displays that showed cascading system failures across his empire. How is this possible? He demanded of his technical staff. These are basic infrastructure systems. They cannot simply fail simultaneously. His chief engineer, a Kithran named Vex, looked at the diagnostic reports with growing alarm. Warprime, it appears that many of our critical systems contain components of human origin. We never considered this a security risk because humans were considered harmless. The same pattern was emerging across the galaxy. The Vel hegemony discovered that their telepathic communication networks relied on human-built relay stations that had suddenly stopped functioning. The Ethereal Collective found that their crystal processing facilities, essential to their technology, were failing because human technicians had embedded shutdown codes in the systems they had been hired to maintain. General Patricia Wells, commander of the Terran Defense Forces ground operations, reviewed the intelligence reports from across human space. "It's remarkable," she told her staff. "They invited us into their homes, showed us their defenses, taught us their weaknesses, and never once considered that we might be paying attention." The most shocking discovery for the galactic community was the scope of human military preparation. What they had dismissed as civilian infrastructure was revealing itself as a vast military network. Research stations throughout the outer systems activated defensive grids that shouldn't have existed. Mining operations deployed weapons platforms that had been disguised as industrial equipment. Even human colony ships were transforming into mobile command centers. Lieutenant Colonel Susan Baker, head of psychological warfare operations, had studied alien species' mental patterns for 2 decades. "The key insight," she explained to her team, "is that they all assumed human patience was the same thing as human weakness. They never considered that we might be patient because we were preparing for something. There were no ultimatums, no demands for surrender, no negotiations offered." The species that had spent 3 centuries dismissing human diplomatic overtures found themselves facing an enemy that had stopped talking entirely. The galaxy's lesson in human patience was about to begin. The war lasted exactly 72 days, though every alien species would later swear it felt like years. Humanity fought with a precision that spoke of centuries of careful planning and barely controlled rage. They had learned their lessons well from 300 years of being dismissed and underestimated. General Patricia Wells stood on the command deck of her flagship, watching the tactical display show the Kithran homeworld surrounded by its own defensive satellites. The irony was almost beautiful. For 50 years, human engineers had helped design and maintain those orbital defense platforms. They knew every circuit, every weakness, every backdoor that had been built into the systems. "Begin Phase 1, she ordered calmly. Her communications officer, Lieutenant David Miller, sent the activation codes that human technicians had quietly installed decades ago. One by one, the mighty Kithran orbital defenses turned their weapons away from space and toward their own planet. Defense platforms that had protected the homeworld for generations began bombarding military installations on the surface. Warprime Thaxon watched from his command bunker as his own satellites destroyed his fleet yards, his training academies, and his weapons factories. His communications with other Kithran worlds went dead as human-installed viruses spread through their networks. Within 6 hours, the most powerful military empire in known space was cut off from its colonies and under siege from its own defenses. "How is this possible?" he screamed at his remaining staff officers. "These systems were built by our best engineers." His intelligence chief, a battle-scarred veteran named Clax, looked at the reports with growing horror. "War Prime, it appears that human contractors worked on nearly every major installation in our empire. We have records going back decades of humans performing maintenance, upgrades and repairs on critical systems." Meanwhile, the Vel hegemony was discovering that their greatest strength had become their fatal weakness. Commander Daniel Cooper had spent 20 years studying their rigid military hierarchy and telepathic communication protocols. He understood exactly how their chain of command worked and how orders flowed through their networks. From his position aboard the stealth ship Phantom, Cooper began broadcasting false orders using perfect mimicry of Vel command frequencies. The telepathic species, so proud of their ability to share thoughts instantly across vast distances, found their own communication system turned against them. "Fleet Group 7, you are ordered to engage Fleet Group 12 immediately," Cooper transmitted, using the exact mental patterns of a Vel fleet master. "They have been compromised by enemy infiltration." The Vel hegemony's fleets, scattered across multiple star systems, began receiving contradictory orders that appeared to come from legitimate command authority. Battle groups that had fought side by side for centuries suddenly found themselves ordered to attack each other. The species that had prided itself on perfect military coordination dissolved into chaos as their own communication network fed them false information. Admiral Helen Price, commanding the assault on ethereal collective space, faced a different challenge. The ancient species existed as a collective consciousness, their individual minds linked in a vast network that had endured for millennia. They considered themselves beyond human understanding, their hive mind too complex for any single consciousness species to comprehend. Lieutenant Colonel Susan Baker had spent her entire career proving them wrong. Her psychological warfare team had studied every recorded interaction with the ethereal collective, mapping their thought patterns and identifying the key weaknesses in their shared consciousness. "The beauty of a hive mind," she explained to her staff as they prepared their attack, "is that if you can convince one part that another part is infected, the whole system will try to protect itself by cutting out the infected sections." Baker's team began broadcasting carefully crafted mental viruses into ethereal space. The signals were designed to mimic the collective's own thought patterns while carrying a simple, devastating message. Sections of the hive mind had been corrupted by an alien influence and needed to be isolated immediately. The ethereal collective, faced with what appeared to be contamination in their sacred unity, began doing exactly what Baker had predicted. They started severing connections between different nodes of their consciousness, desperately trying to prevent the spread of what they believed was mental infection. The species that had existed as one mind for thousands of years began fragmenting itself in panic. Captain Michael Foster's fleet eliminated the Zephyrian crystal stations with surgical precision. The crystalline beings had always considered themselves superior to biological species, their bodies made of living mineral that could survive in the vacuum of space. They had built their cities and stations out of the same crystal material, creating structures of incredible beauty and strength. But Foster's ships carried weapons specifically designed to shatter crystal matrices. For decades, human scientists had studied Zephyrian physiology and architecture under the guise of cultural exchange programs. They had learned exactly how to disrupt the harmonic frequencies that held Zephyrian crystal structures together. The weapon strikes didn't just destroy buildings and ships. They sent devastating resonance waves through any Zephyrian caught in the area, their crystal bodies shattering like glass. The species that had dismissed human emotions as primitive biological responses discovered what focused human anger could accomplish. Throughout the war, the most unsettling aspect for the alien species was humanity's complete silence. Every attempt at communication was ignored. Offers of surrender were met with continued attacks. Pleas for negotiation received no response whatsoever. The species that had spent 3 centuries teaching humanity that talk was useless found themselves facing an enemy that had learned the lesson perfectly. There were no demands, no ultimatums, no mercy. The humans had tried talking for 300 years, and it had gotten them nothing but contempt and casual murder. Admiral Mitchell, coordinating the overall campaign from Earth, watched the tactical reports with grim satisfaction. "They wanted to teach us that might makes right," he told his staff. "Congratulations. We learned." When the last alien fleet finally broadcast surrender codes, they found themselves in a position no species in galactic history had ever experienced. They were facing humans who simply didn't care about their surrender. The galaxy's education in human patience was complete, but the final lesson was yet to come. The reformed Galactic Council met for the first time in 6 months, and everything had changed. The massive chamber looked the same with its soaring ceilings and rows of seats designed for dozens of different species, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where once alien representatives had lounged casually in their chairs, now they sat upright and alert. Where once human diplomats had been ignored or dismissed, now every eye in the chamber focused on the small group of humans entering through the main doors. Ambassador Margaret Thompson walked to her seat with measured steps. She wore the same dark blue formal jacket she had always worn, but now it bore new additions. A small medal on her chest marked her service during what historians were already calling the 72-Day War. Scars on her left hand showed where she had been injured during the final negotiations that ended the conflict. Most significantly, she no longer walked alone to her seat. Captain William Davis, now promoted to general, walked beside her, along with Admiral Robert Mitchell and a full military escort. The other species watched this procession with careful attention. Warprime Thaxon, his once proud carapace now bearing deep scars from human weapons, shifted uncomfortably in his reinforced chair. Several of his mandibles had been replaced with mechanical substitutes after his capture and subsequent release. The Zephyrian delegate's crystal form was noticeably smaller than before, his body still recovering from the resonance weapons that had shattered half his mass during the siege of their homeworld. Margaret took her seat and looked around the chamber with eyes that had seen things no human diplomat before her had witnessed. She had watched alien fleets surrender. She had walked through the ruins of enemy military installations. She had signed documents that redrew the boundaries of galactic civilization. The patient diplomat who had spent decades pleading for basic rights was gone, replaced by someone who commanded respect through demonstrated power. Honored delegates, she began, using the formal address that protocol still required, though now the title carried different meaning. Humanity returns to this chamber to establish the new terms of galactic coexistence. The silence that followed was profound. For 3 centuries, human representatives had asked for things. Now Margaret was telling the galaxy how things would be. She stood up slowly, and every alien representative tracked her movement with the careful attention usually reserved for dangerous predators. I want to be clear about what has changed and what has not. Humanity still seeks peaceful coexistence with all species. We still prefer diplomatic solutions to military ones. We still believe that civilized beings should be able to resolve their differences through negotiation rather than violence. Warprime Thaxon's mechanical mandibles clicked nervously. The sound was different now, harsher than his natural mandibles had been. Ambassador Thompson, the Kithran Empire acknowledges the effectiveness of human military capabilities. We are prepared to discuss reasonable territorial adjustments. Margaret looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn during 3 decades of diplomatic service, but now there was steel beneath the politeness. I'm not here to discuss anything, Warprime. I'm here to inform you of decisions that have already been made. She activated a holographic display that showed a map of the galaxy. Red lines marked the new boundaries of human space, boundaries that included systems the major species had claimed for generations. Blue markers showed human military installations that had been established during the war and would remain permanently operational. The Kepler system trade routes are now under human administration, she announced. The shipping restrictions that prevented human access for 50 years are permanently lifted. The systems containing our agricultural colonies are now designated as human sovereign territory, with a 50 light-year buffer zone that will be patrolled by human defense forces. The Vel hegemony representative, his multiple eyes reflecting anxiety, raised one of his long arms. Ambassador, these territorial claims encompass regions that have been administered by the hegemony for centuries. Surely some compromise can be reached. Margaret's expression didn't change. There will be no compromise. You had 300 years to reach compromises with humanity. You chose to dismiss every proposal, deny every request, and ignore every plea. The time for negotiation ended when you decided that murdering 2 million human civilians was an acceptable military exercise. She touched another control, and the display changed to show economic data. Human trade networks will resume operations, but under new terms. Species that wish to access human shipping, human technology, or human services will do so according to contracts that we approve. The days of taking human capabilities for granted are over. Admiral Mitchell stood up beside her. His presence was a reminder that human patience was now backed by proven military capability. Any species that interferes with human shipping, threatens human colonies, or attempts to restrict human movement will be considered to be in a state of war with humanity. We will not issue warnings. We will not send diplomatic protests. We will respond with immediate military action. The chamber was absolutely silent. The casual arrogance that had characterized alien attitudes toward humanity for 3 centuries had been replaced by something approaching fear. These beings had learned that the patient species they had dismissed as weak possessed capabilities that could humble galactic empires in a matter of days. Margaret sat back down and looked around the chamber one final time. I want every species here to understand something very important. Humanity remembers. We remember every insult, every dismissal, every moment you mistook our patience for weakness. We remember the children of New Geneva who will never grow up because of your casual cruelty. She paused, letting that sink in. But we also remember which species showed us respect when they could have chosen arrogance. Which representatives spoke honestly when they could have chosen deception. Which leaders sought genuine peace when they could have chosen exploitation. The vote on the new galactic order was unanimous. Not because every species agreed with humanity's terms, but because every species now understood that opposition was futile. The galaxy had learned its lesson about human patience, and they would never make the mistake of testing it again.